Think about every major conflict you've seen on the news in the last 50 years. Iraq, Libya, Syria, Venezuela. The official reasons given always sound noble, don't they? Democracy, human rights, weapons of mass destruction. But what if I told you there's a single economic system underlying most of these conflicts that almost nobody talks about? A system so powerful that it's shaped American foreign policy for half a century and determined which nations get invaded and which ones don't. It all starts with a decision made in the early 1970s that would change the world forever. To understand it, you need to know what was happening to America at that time. In 1971, President Nixon did something that shocked the world. He ended the gold standard. For decades, the US dollar had been backed by gold. Other countries could exchange their dollars for actual gold from Fort Knox. But America had been printing more money than it had gold to back it up, and Nixon knew the whole system was about to collapse. The pressure had been building for years. The Vietnam War was expensive. Social programs were expensive. And other countries, particularly France under Charles de Gaulle, had started demanding gold for their dollars. They could see that America had printed far more dollars than it had gold reserves. The French were literally sending ships to New York to collect gold bars. If this had continued, Fort Knox would have been emptied, and the world would have seen that the emperor had no clothes. So Nixon just ended it. Overnight, the dollar became what's called a fiat currency. It was now backed by nothing except trust in the US government. And that presented a massive problem. Why would anyone want to hold dollars anymore? Why would other countries continue to use dollars for international trade when they weren't backed by anything tangible? The dollar could have collapsed right then and there. America could have lost its position as the center of global finance. Everything depended on finding a new reason for the world to need dollars. The answer came just 2 years later, and it was brilliant in its simplicity. In 1973, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. The terms were straightforward. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil only in US dollars. Not in yen, not in francs, not in marks. Only dollars. And in exchange, the United States would provide military protection to Saudi Arabia and sell them weapons. By 1975, every country in OPEC had agreed to the same deal. Now stop and think about what this meant. Oil is the most traded commodity on Earth. Every country needs it. Cars, planes, factories, militaries, everything runs on oil. And suddenly, if you wanted to buy oil, you had no choice. You had to have US dollars. It didn't matter if you were Japan, France, or Brazil. You needed dollars. This created something economists call artificial demand for the US currency. Countries around the world started stockpiling dollars in their central banks. They needed those reserves to buy oil. This system became known as the petrodollar, and it gave America an extraordinary power that no empire in history had ever possessed. Here's how that power works. Because everyone needs dollars, the US can print as much money as it wants without suffering the normal consequences. In any other country, if you print too much money, your currency loses value and nobody wants it anymore. But with the petrodollar system, there's always demand for dollars because countries need them for oil. This lets America run massive budget deficits, fight expensive wars, and maintain a standard of living that would bankrupt any other nation. Think about what this means in practical terms. The United States can buy products from China, electronics from Japan, cars from Germany, and just pay for all of it with printed dollars. Those countries then have to hold those dollars because they need them to buy oil. It's an incredible arrangement. America gets real goods, and in return, it provides pieces of paper that cost almost nothing to produce. No other country has this privilege. But the system only works if everyone plays along. And that's where things get interesting. What happens when a country decides it doesn't want to sell oil in dollars anymore? What happens when someone threatens to break the petrodollar system? Let's look at Iraq. In the year 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would start selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. This was a direct threat to the petrodollar system. If other oil-producing countries followed Iraq's lead, the entire system could unravel. 3 years later, in 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The official reason was weapons of mass destruction, which we later found out didn't exist. One of the first things the US did after toppling Saddam was switch Iraq's oil sales back to dollars. Now you might say that's just a coincidence. But let's look at Libya. Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya for over 40 years. For most of that time, the West tolerated him despite his human rights record. He was eccentric, brutal at times, but he wasn't considered enough of a threat to warrant regime change. But in 2011, something changed. Gaddafi had been working on creating a gold-backed African currency called the gold dinar. He wanted African nations to use this currency for oil sales instead of the US dollar. He had the resources to make it happen too. Libya had massive gold reserves and lots of oil. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's emails, which were later released, show that French intelligence was deeply concerned about Gaddafi's plans for the gold dinar. They saw it as a threat to the franc and to French economic influence in Africa. Within months, NATO led a bombing campaign in Libya. Gaddafi was killed, and Libya descended into chaos that continues to this day. The plans for the gold dinar died with him. Libya's gold reserves, some 144 tons, disappeared in the chaos. Nobody talks about where that gold went. Then there's Syria. You might wonder why the United States has been so invested in toppling Bashar al-Assad. Syria isn't even a major oil producer. But here's what many people don't know. In 2006, Syria signed a pipeline deal with Iran and Iraq. This pipeline would have transported oil and gas from Iran through Iraq and Syria to Europe. The crucial detail? These sales would not have been conducted in US dollars. Iran had already opened an oil exchange that traded in currencies other than the dollar. Compare that to the competing pipeline proposal that Syria rejected. That pipeline would have carried oil from Saudi Arabia and Qatar through Syria to Europe. Those sales would have been in dollars, supporting the petrodollar system. When Assad chose the Iran pipeline instead, Syria's fate was essentially sealed. The country has been devastated by war ever since, with the US supporting various rebel groups. Look at what's happening with Venezuela right now. The country has the largest oil reserves on Earth, even more than Saudi Arabia. For years, the US has been trying to remove President Nicolas Maduro from power, implementing crushing sanctions and recognizing opposition leaders as the legitimate president. The official reason is that Maduro is a dictator and socialism has destroyed the country. But here's the thing. Maduro has been selling Venezuelan oil in currencies other than the dollar, especially to China. Venezuela has been moving away from the petrodollar system. They've been accepting yuan, euros, and even cryptocurrencies for oil sales. This is exactly the kind of behavior that triggers American intervention. Now contrast all of this with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government has one of the worst human rights records in the world. Journalists are murdered. Women only recently got the right to drive. Political dissidents are imprisoned and tortured. Yemen has been bombed into a humanitarian catastrophe by Saudi forces. And yet, the United States continues to call Saudi Arabia an ally, sells them billions in weapons, and presidents from both parties bow and curtsy to Saudi kings. Why? Because Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of the petrodollar system. As long as the Saudis sell oil in dollars and convince other OPEC nations to do the same, the system survives. The geopolitical reality is simple. Countries that challenge the petrodollar system face regime change. Countries that support it get unwavering American backing regardless of what else they do. But here's where things get really interesting. The petrodollar system might be coming to an end anyway. China has been making moves to challenge it for years now. In 2018, China launched an oil futures market where oil can be traded in yuan. They've been signing bilateral agreements with countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela to trade oil in currencies other than the dollar. China is now the world's largest importer of oil, and they're increasingly bypassing the dollar for these purchases. Russia has been moving away from the dollar too. After the US imposed sanctions on Russia in 2014, the Russians started conducting more trade in rubles and other currencies. They've been selling oil and natural gas to China in yuan. They've massively increased their gold reserves and reduced their dollar holdings. This is a direct challenge to American economic dominance. Russia and China together represent a massive portion of global energy trade, and if they successfully move away from the dollar, others will follow. Even the European Union has talked about creating systems to trade oil in euros, especially for purchases from Iran. After President Trump pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, European countries were frustrated that they couldn't continue buying Iranian oil because of US sanctions. The sanctions only work because oil is traded in dollars, and banks need access to the dollar system. Europe started exploring ways to work around this. They created something called INSTEX, a special payment channel designed to bypass dollar transactions. It hasn't been widely used yet, but the fact that it exists shows how the petrodollar's grip is weakening. What's fascinating is how little this is discussed in mainstream political discourse. You'll hear endless debates about democracy, terrorism, human rights, and humanitarian intervention. But the petrodollar system is rarely mentioned, even though it provides a much clearer explanation for American foreign policy decisions than the official narratives do. Politicians won't talk about it. Mainstream media barely touches it. And most people have never even heard the term petrodollar, despite the fact that it's been the foundation of global economics for 50 years. The system has allowed the United States to live beyond its means for 50 years. America has been able to run trillion-dollar deficits, maintain military bases in over 70 countries, and consume far more than it produces. The rest of the world has essentially been subsidizing the American lifestyle because they need dollars for oil. American consumers enjoy lower prices and more purchasing power than they would otherwise have. The US government can spend without the discipline that other nations face. But empires don't last forever, and neither do the systems they create. The Romans debased their currency. The British lost their colonial holdings. And the American petrodollar system is showing cracks. As more countries trade oil in other currencies, the artificial demand for dollars decreases. When that demand drops significantly, America will face a reckoning. The government won't be able to print money without consequences anymore. The standard of living could drop dramatically. The global economic order that's existed since the 1970s will fundamentally change. This is why you see such aggressive American foreign policy toward any country that challenges the system. It's not really about spreading democracy or stopping terrorism. Those might be secondary concerns, but the primary issue is maintaining the petrodollar. Because once that system truly collapses, American economic and military dominance collapses with it. The ability to print the world's reserve currency is the ultimate form of power, and no empire gives that up willingly. Understanding the petrodollar doesn't just explain the past. It helps you predict the future. Watch which countries start moving away from the dollar for oil sales. Those will be the countries that suddenly develop human rights problems in the international media. Those will be the countries facing sanctions, coups, or military intervention. The next time you see news about a conflict in an oil-producing nation, ask yourself a simple question. What's this country's relationship to the petrodollar system? More often than not, you'll find that the answer explains far more than the official story ever could. Wars aren't fought for the reasons stated in press conferences. They're fought to maintain the economic systems that keep empires running. And for the last 50 years, that system has been the petrodollar.